Okay, good day everyone. Welcome to this breakout session on challenges and opportunities in renewable energy deployment in emerging economies. So I think we had a fantastic first session, the plenary. I think it was very interesting with a lot of different views. And interesting is a slightly overused word, but I think it was quite appropriate in this morning's context. And I think we're going to keep the fun going with this particular discussion. So just to set a bit of context over and above what we learned this morning, where it was more focused on finance, and here we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the real-world impact of renewable deployment and the challenges that come with it. But firstly, just to put into context where the developing world stands and where the emerging world stands, and why it's very important to have that in any conversation about renewables. Firstly, 30% of all global electricity demand is coming from China. China accounts for 30% of world power. China also accounts for 30% of the entire solar generation in the world. I mean, US and Europe, we talk a lot about Europe, but Europe, EU and US put together, it's about 25%. India and China together are going to account for 2/3 of the entire incremental demand for electricity over the next 3 years. That's where the chunk of growth is going to come from. And already with countries like Brazil, China, 15% of their power system, of their electricity generation, is coming from wind and solar. In India's case, it's closer to 10 and rising. But the point about growth brings us to the second point, which is that along with the transition, energy access, and this was a point that was also made earlier, energy access becomes quite important because there is a need for power, for growth in these countries. So that's one conundrum that we have. The second point is almost, I would say, 90 to 95% of the supply chain for renewables, especially in solar, but also increasingly in wind, is coming from Asia, again, primarily China, which means at a time when geopolitics is becoming more important, and we are starting to look for considerations, not just cost, but friendshoring, et cetera, that needs to be considered while making plans on renewable energy. The third point is, of course, energy is not just about economics, it is about people. I think 7 of the 8 most populated countries in the world are outside the G7, including, and I think 5 of them are in Asia, including number 1, 2, 4, and 5. So having that in the conversation is again quite important. And then finally, there is no single emerging markets or developing world. Yesterday at the plenary, we already saw that. We had 2 different viewpoints, both from developing countries, in terms of where fossil fuels should be, what the role of renewables should be, the impacts from climate. So this is diverse across different economies, different geographies, and that's something which again makes the developing world and emerging world a bit of a challenge to handle. So I'm very pleased that we have 3 very, very really eminent people here, highly knowledgeable about various different emerging and developing markets, to talk today about renewables. We'll start first with Charles Worringham, who some of you know, or many of you know, because Charles has also been a guest contributor to IEEFA, which we much appreciate. So Charles, after an academic career in the field of, not very related field of movement neuroscience, Charles became interested in India's energy transition due to its disproportionate impact on climate policy and action. This led to several visits with energy practitioners and experts across the country to learn not just about India's many energy successes in transition, but how these are being shaped by the country's significant development. So can I welcome Charles to first make his presentation, and then we'll move on to Alex and then Yael.
Thank you very much, Ramnath, and good morning, everybody. I will be leading up to some remarks specifically about India, and I have been a keen observer of the transition in that country over the last few years. But I thought it would actually be quite useful to begin with a little bit more broadly by emphasizing a point that was made in the plenary session this morning, and that is that emerging and developing economies and countries are by no means all the same. There's great heterogeneity. And so the first 2 points really are about that, and I'm going to illustrate that by comparing India with 2 countries I know much less about, but it's an interesting exercise to learn a little, and that is Brazil and Nigeria. So what I'm going to do first is just lead you through some maps, and I want you to pick up from this. First of all, the reason for selecting these 2 additional countries is between India, Nigeria, and Brazil. By mid-century, about every 4th person on this planet will be from those 3 countries. So what happens there is extremely significant. And of course, they all cluster down pretty low on the axes of wealth and indeed contributions to our climate challenges. So these maps are all just laid out in roughly the same way, and I'd like you to start in the top left with population density. So in India, the population is densest up in the north, with some pockets down the coast and in southern India. Population growth is highest in the north, but very interestingly, and not perhaps widely appreciated, is that India is now at just about replacement rates for fertility. It's not really growing in the birth sense at all. The additional 300-odd million people by mid-century will actually be coming from people living longer, not by a great increase in births. The grid is pretty well developed. The solar resource in the top right is very distributed across the country. The wind resource is concentrated in the west and the south. The coal mines are in eastern India, but the coal plants, 900 plus operating and in construction coal-fired power units, are quite widely distributed across the country. If we turn to Brazil, people live predominantly close to the coast, within about 500 kilometers in a band around the east coast. Population is growing fastest, technically, in the west, in the Amazon region, but of course, because the population is so low there, the real addition in absolute numbers is in the cities and towns of the east. The grid really reflects that population distribution. The solar resource is sitting just behind where the population lives, and the wind resource is focused up in the north, close to, again, population, whereas the hydropower infrastructure lies predominantly in the south, closer to Rio and Sao Paulo. If we turn to Nigeria, we get a real bifurcation. There's a northern concentration of population and a southern, growth predominantly in the north, a very weak grid. Only about a little over half of all Nigerians have any access to electricity. The solar resource is in the north, and so is the wind, and the gas infrastructure, which powers that very shaky grid, is focused in the south. And when we talk about things like population density, this is a pretty relative concept, because each square here is a square kilometer. Each dot represents a person. So Nigeria has, on average, 10 times the population density of Brazil. Of course, the Amazon is one of the reasons for that. And India, pretty much double again Nigeria's. And of course, if you think about electricity demand and load and the economics of that, then the absolute density is a big factor. So that's just to really reinforce the point that countries are really very different in their needs. And from this alone, we can start to pick out a few ideas about where renewable energy might head. And I'll really emphasize the bottom part of this. So Brazil has a hydro-dominated grid, so it's already pretty clean in that sense. But the big problem is the oscillation between periods of drought and flood. So over years, the challenge really is to manage that balance. So integrating new wind and solar, potentially with the technology that Julian Hunt has written about, which is seasonal pumped hydro, using very small pockets of land for managing season-to-season variations for hydro, is a very intriguing possibility. When you look at Nigeria, and you look at the northern region in particular, it's pretty hard to imagine a better place for a major rollout of distributed renewable energy, because there's no grid, but there's lots of solar and wind and much need for power. In India, the challenge is a little different. It's really keeping up with demand growth. And right now, coal is winning the race against renewables. In the last year or so, the increase in electrical energy is essentially 3-to-1 coal against renewables. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the rural economy and its needs, because we often think about the mega cities of India. But before I do that, I want to point out that there is one, I think, Achilles heel in the relentless sort of momentum that coal has. It's not in mining. Mining is increasing. The big mines are growing. More mines are being built. It's not in generation, because there's plenty of unused capacity in the thermal power plants. But there is a potential bottleneck in coal logistics. And congestion on the rail system is a very significant issue. Last year, between March and May, 1,900 passenger trains were cancelled in favor of coal trains just to keep the power plants supplied. And this is a long-term problem that's been there. Coal India has announced plans to more than double the amount of coal moved by trains in the next 4 years. Frankly, I don't believe it will happen. I think the congestion issue is going to be very considerable. I've got some data here I've pulled from Indian Railways monthly reports to show what's happened in terms of train speeds. If you look at the green line, that's the speed of passenger trains pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, when there was very little traffic, it all went up, and post-pandemic. And as of April this year, train speeds for passenger traffic in India have dropped to lower than the average speed in 2019 before the pandemic. Freight train speed has kept up a little bit, but if you look at the gray bars, that's the number of people traveling by train. Every month, currently, 100 million fewer Indians are traveling by passenger train than before the pandemic. So we actually have a much poorer passenger service at slower speeds. And this is because freight is crowding out passenger traffic, and within freight, coal is crowding out other really economically valuable goods that could be being moved by train. So the final thing I really want to make as a bit of a pitch is to look more seriously at the needs of the rural economy and the rural sector in India. Having traveled around by train, you get the impression it's one enormous farm. And in a sense it is, because 60% of India's land mass is farmed. That's half again as much as the average for the world. And there are a number of issues here, one of which is simply, where is all the renewable energy going to be positioned? It cannot all be in the dry, more arid areas of the northwest, because of distribution challenges and transmission challenges, and also because there's some pretty important open grassland ecosystems that are quite vulnerable. So I think that a lot of the renewable energy that will be needed for a net zero India will in fact have to be on farmland. And the question is how to do that intelligently and in a way that is fair to the rural sector. And there are a number of measures that can be thought about to accomplish this. But we have to recognize that the other factor is that rural India is still in very considerable economic distress. The average farm size is now less than 1 hectare. It's very, very difficult to live off that. There is great indebtedness, and it's not for no reason that unfortunately as many as 60,000 Indian farmers take their own lives each year. There's a very serious rural crisis that's ongoing. India has fallen further down the hunger index in recent years, and there's a major challenge in providing sufficient nutrition for the entire population. And it doesn't help, I'd refer in the bottom right here to a report I did on ethanol blending policy. The government is pushing to double the amount of ethanol in petrol blending for vehicles. It doesn't really help to have policies like that in some senses, because the land use implications of growing crops to make ethanol, when compared with the alternative of using that land for solar to recharge electric vehicles, is a difference of about 200-fold. It's a really significant difference. And however, there are some bright spots, and one of these is the potential to get policies to grow agrivoltaics, which is the practice of using land for the production of food as well as energy. And it's really in its nascent stage in India. but there are about 20 demonstration projects, and I wrote a report on this 18 months ago that suggested that it could be particularly suitable for India for various reasons, but one of which is that it's very, very suitable for semi-arid and arid conditions because it can help preserve soil moisture, which is a very real issue. However, it does require a number of regulatory and financial measures to really help it to grow. But and I've listed those there, and I won't go through those. One critical one, however, is the designation of a new land use category, because presently, if you want to turn a farm into for solar, it has to be reclassified as commercial land, and that creates all sorts of problems. But the real pitch I want to leave you with is that the needs of the rural sector are very, very real, and the only way this is going to work is if the rural sector gets a stake in renewable energy. It cannot simply be imposed. It shouldn't just be developer-led. The rural community must be given a financial ownership and control stake in renewable energy, I believe, if it's to succeed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Charles. I think that was a very good look at, almost like a neuroscientist look at what's going on in the Indian renewable sector. Excellent. So next we will have Alex Hogeveen Rutter. Now Alex is a power systems professional with experience in transmission, distribution, hydropower, solar, storage, and green hydrogen. He brings experience of working on green energy projects across many developing countries, multiple continents. He is currently based in India. At his current private sector specialist role with the International Solar Alliance, Hogeveen Rutter leads private sector engagement on renewable energy projects in least developed countries. Previously, he led the IFC's work on green hydrogen and energy storage in Asia Pacific. He writes extensively on energy issues. I would highly recommend his blog, which he writes every week, and is a strong advocate for affordable and reliable renewable energy, including storage. So, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Ramnath. And I'll try and go fairly quickly because I think the presentation this morning in the plenary, I think, covered a lot of key issues, particularly around the needs for energy access. With that, it's moving this presentation, not that presentation. It's moving the laptop, not the... Oh, sorry, thank you. Okay, so yes, a few key issues here. One is who is responsible for the green transition? How much RE capacity do emerging markets need? And how can developed countries help? So historical emissions, I think it's really important that we hear this message here in the West. This is something that's talked about a lot. So India, with 18% of the world's population, has about 3% of historical emissions, versus US, with about 4% of the world's population, has about 25% of global cumulative emissions. Canada, where I'm from, with 0.5% of the world's population, has about 2% of the world's historical emissions. So when it comes to who needs to pay a green premium, or who needs to act faster on climate change, who needs to basically bite the bullet, I hope this makes it pretty clear. So a few examples, Komati coal plant. This was a coal plant in South Africa where they had a 1,000 megawatt coal plant. The World Bank had a just transition, quote unquote, program to say we're going to replace this 1,000 megawatt coal plant with 150 megawatts of solar and 70 megawatts of wind. Well, unsurprisingly, people in South Africa were not so happy about this deal because you need to be building at least 10 times that to replace a coal plant. And South Africa right now is going through devastating power outages, which is impacting MSMEs, which is impacting residential homes, which is impacting air conditioning. Another example, World Bank Solar Rooftop Program for India has achieved 0.365 gigawatts versus the government target of 40 gigawatts. This 100 billion in climate finance that has been talked about at COP after COP and has not materialized. And again, my personal experience working with development finance institutions, there's often this expectation that as we move in the West to very high standards for environmental protection and resettlement and replacement, That's a luxury you have in the West where everybody has energy access. And so you say, I'm going to move to replacing coal with renewables. It's a very different situation when you are still struggling with energy access. Actual quote from a contact in South Africa: I believe that European countries are funding renewable energy in South Africa so they can buy South African coal cheaper. I'm not saying I agree with that point of view. I'm just saying this mistrust where you have these broken promises, particularly in countries like the United States and China, or in Canada, that have been laggards in climate action. And now we go to developing markets and say, you need to move faster. There's a reason that there's not a lot of trust there. So this is a map I created. What if everyone in the world was prosperous but energy efficient? So this is the current electricity consumption on the left, and this is the proposed fair electricity consumption on the right. So as you can see, China basically stays the same, but countries like India, Nigeria, South Africa, Indonesia get much, much bigger, and countries like the United States and Canada, we need to shrink. We need to consume a lot less. The opportunity is massive. So, on the left, we've got new annual gigawatts of wind and solar required just for demand growth. And so I actually really don't like the word energy transition, because in a lot of these countries, they can't transition their coal fleet to renewables. They first need to meet that demand growth. And so here's just 4 examples of countries where you see the new wind and solar required to meet the demand growth versus the green bar is how much annual capacity addition they're doing today. The one on the right, this is the electricity consumption of Nigeria, which has a population of about 220 million, versus the energy consumption of Texas and California, with populations of 30 and 40 million. So to say, oh, Nigeria, you need to do an energy transition is frankly ridiculous. Nigeria needs to sextuple their energy consumption, and so how are we going to make sure that new generation is clean? Once we've figured that out, then to me we can go back and say, how do we replace that small little chunk there? But yes, so the question I would pose: how do we build California's entire electricity grid, except do it 100% green, and do it in Nigeria, and do it by 2030? This is the kind of challenge, this is the kind of thinking, this is the kind of scale we need to be thinking about. And one of the main reasons I moved to India was Ontario had actually retired one of their coal plants, and Ontario said, no more coal plants. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. But India is building more coal every year versus Canada's entire coal fleet. So we need to make sure that this is clean and green. So in many countries, RE plus storage is already economic versus coal. This is cut off a little bit, but countries like Japan and Korea, it's not economic yet. RE plus storage is still more expensive than coal. So as developed countries, as rich countries, do they have a responsibility to be absorbing that green premium? As opposed to, say, an Indonesia, where there's much less capacity to pay that green premium. And for countries like the United States or Canada, where renewable energy is much cheaper than coal, to me there's really no excuse. So India, as I said, is still building new coal, and so we really need to stop, to be honest, stop talking about the environment so much, because as soon as you start framing it as we need to do carbon phase out, we need to do coal phase down, we need to do phase out, we need to save the planet, India and South Africa and Indonesia are going to be rightly say, you guys caused the problem, you saved the planet, I need to worry about development. So if we're going to bring RE solutions to these countries, we need to phrase it as pro-development, as meeting energy access needs, as supporting their development to become industrialized nations, and put much less emphasis on the carbon mitigation. This is just a very sample ladder of different technologies. So as we know, some technologies are already economic today, and some technologies like, say, green hydrogen are not economic today. So to me, there's a responsibility to help finance the stuff that is economic, so the wind and solar, the electric vehicles, building efficiency. Let's make sure we're doing that. And then in developed countries, let's do the carbon capture and the green hydrogen and the marine aviation, the kind of things that are more challenging, so that we can drive the cost down, so that they become economic and developing countries can adopt them. Just like, let's say, Germany led on solar 15 years ago, helped create the scale that drove the cost down that now makes it economic for emerging markets. But to expect emerging markets to do things that are not economic today is a very, very tough sell. So finally, I want to leave kind of with a framework for the way I think we need to approach climate finance. And yeah, this one, okay, so I used to work for consulting, so we like our 2x2 matrices. So there's countries where RE is economic in the sense that it's cheaper than coal, and RE is bankable. So this would be countries like India, where the economics make sense today, but there's a lot of technical challenges. How do we integrate that? How do we make regulators comfortable with it? How do we use energy storage? How do we improve our market design to incorporate renewable energy? In the second box, we have countries where RE is economic. Can I go back or no? Okay, RE is economic, but it's not yet bankable. Oh yeah, so here we have countries like, let's say Nigeria, where there's a big challenge in terms of nobody wants to finance a project and sell it to a distribution utility in Nigeria. So how can we use de-risking mechanisms? How can we use first loss guarantees, which ISA has a solar facility that we're trying to raise funding for, and you would not believe the people in Europe and North America who say, there's plenty of funding. We don't need any new funds for emerging markets. And I'm just here to say very, very clearly, there's not enough funding. We need way, way more first loss guarantees. We need way more political risk insurance. And particularly, we need concessional financing. A lot of people, there's a huge disconnect between the developed countries when they say 100 billion, developing countries have the impression that at least a significant portion of this will be concessional. And when developed countries say, I'm financing this, they say, oh no, I'm loaning you at 12% interest rate because that's where it falls on my risk return. Secondly, we have countries where RE plus storage is bankable but not economic. So countries like Indonesia or Uzbekistan, where people are willing to bring projects, but they have such cheap gas or such cheap coal that the economics don't make sense today. So who's going to pay that green premium? I don't think Indonesia is going to pay that green premium. I don't think from a historical justice point of view, it makes sense for Indonesia to pay that green premium. So who is going to pay that green premium to persuade Indonesians to take an uneconomic form of energy today? Finally, we have countries like Bangladesh, where RE plus storage, it's neither economic nor is it bankable. And here we kind of need all of the above. And I think we really need a lot more creativity. Are we going to have transmission from Nepal to Bangladesh? Are we going to use SMRs? Are we going to have wind and solar exported from India? But there we need a lot of creativity in terms of how we're going to build the capacity that people in Bangladesh need to live sustainable, prosperous lives. So with that, I'm sorry I talk a little fast, but hopefully you've kind of taken away this message that we need to focus not just on the transition for developed economies, but actually building out entirely new systems in emerging markets. And those who are responsible for historical emissions, I think, have a proportionate responsibility to help pay that green premium in emerging markets.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. I actually think we did a scheduling error because the next door is where you all should be. There's an energy transition mechanism being discussed there. It looks like that's what we really need to figure out, how the financing has got to be done and how it's got to be sequenced. We'll now have our third speaker, which is Yael Taranto. She works as an energy analyst at Shura Energy Transition Center in Turkey, in Istanbul. Yael previously worked as manager and economist at Turkey's Industrial Development Bank until 2018, where she was involved in the preparation of over 300 feasibility and project assessment reports, including over 200 in the energy sector. She has worked in close contact with development finance institutions such as the World Bank, EIB, KfW, etc., and participated in negotiations on energy, renewable energy, and the environment. She has also contributed to the framework of Turkey's first green bond and is a prolific writer and presenter in various publications and at universities on energy sustainable development. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Ramnath, for the introduction, and very special thanks to IEFA for this organization, for inviting me to participate as speaker, and also for the privilege of being able to attend all the conferences here and meet some wonderful people. My presentation actually, and also I would like to thank Charles and Alex for setting the stage. What I'm going to try and do is present Turkey as a case, what the energy transition challenges. And as I go along, I will try to point out what is unique to Turkey and what is basically a common problem that maybe all countries are facing, or maybe mostly developing countries are facing. So to go on, just a very brief introduction to Shura Energy Transition Center, where I'm working, just to set the stage. It's a transparent, independent, and non-profit platform working for Turkey's energy transition with Turkey's priorities to stimulate discussion on the energy sector among all interested stakeholders, and most important, providing fact-based, unbiased, and independent research and analysis. And we do this to promote the debate on Turkey's energy transition. So to go on to what Turkey looks like, this is a basic fact sheet. We can say that it's an upper middle income, mid-sized country, and it's located just in the middle of the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. And the prevalent metaphor for Turkey is that it's a bridge, which I think is a metaphor that works, although it's become a cliche over the years. What I would like to stress here is that what Turkey's energy policy focus has been over the years, what the policy focus is aiming to enhance energy security and reducing trade and current account deficits by increasing the share of domestic resources in energy production. You know, that has been the gist of it. So when we're talking about domestic resources, what are we talking about? Turkey, as you can see by location, it's in the middle of a sea of fossil resources, but it has none itself, except for some lignite, which tends to be sort of low calorie, high sulfur. So, but on the other hand, there are a lot of renewable resources, including a lot of hydro, which has been mostly utilized, wind, solar, etc. So when we're talking about Turkey, we are, in fact, going back to Alex's classification, one of the countries where the energy transition actually works. It's also important for structural change toward higher value added, more efficient, and less import-intensive activities, which are needed to overcome all of Turkey's inflationary and exchange rate pressures, which we're currently facing, and also to avoid the middle-income trap. Turkey has been a middle-income country for the longest time, as well as growth in carbon emissions. So here we have a story where the fit is good, but of course there are challenges which are faced. In terms of primary energy mix, it's something like 85%. It goes down to 83% when we have good hydro production, to 15% more fossil to renewable ratio. Now, as every country, Turkey faces this energy trilemma with the energy transition. You have to balance energy security with affordability and sustainability. So those are the main issues. And of course, the energy transition is a mix of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and electrification, which is, this of course is not unique to Turkey, but Turkey does have its own unique position within that. And here's Turkey standing on the energy trilemma. Now we have energy security and Turkey's current account deficit, which is a persistent problem, are very much intertwined, and reliance on imported fossil fuels is a major factor in Turkey's persisting foreign trade and current account deficits, which need to be overcome. And what we see is that international fossil fuel prices, particularly crude oil prices, have a major impact on the size of these deficits. Affordability, of course, is an important issue. Tariffs for both natural gas and electricity have increased substantially, as in most places in the world, in the past 2 or 3 years. Whereas household tariffs for both electricity and natural gas are heavily subsidized. And the government provides free power, natural gas, and coal up to a minimum threshold for specified low-income households. And despite all these subsidies, we still have a significant majority of households spending more than 10% of their disposable income on energy, which is sort of like a cutoff point by the EU on how you would describe energy poverty. We don't have physical access issues in Turkey. We have a pretty mature power grid. But we do have an affordability issue, which the government has been addressing by subsidizing mostly fossil fuels. In terms of sustainability, energy-related emissions form 70% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which have been growing at an average annual rate of 2.8% over the past 5 years. So that's another challenge we're facing. And 90% of the population is exposed to air pollution, and none of the urban centers meet WHO air quality standards. So this is also a problem we have with so much fossil use. So where are some of the challenges and opportunities when we look at end-use consumption? Because this is the main determinant when you come to think of it. We can see that the power sector transformation is already underway. We have over 40% renewable share in power generation, with wind and solar exceeding 15%, and renewable constitute most of new generation capacity. This, of course, is not unique to Turkey. This is what's happening in many parts of the world, but at least we can say that Turkey is not falling behind here. Manufacturing sector is the largest energy user, and we have well-developed industrial sector with iron, steel, cement, glass, ceramics, textiles, chemicals, petrochemicals, which are all major energy consumers. But low carbon energy use is becoming a major factor for export competitiveness. Why is that? This is both because of cost, but also because our trading partners, EU is a big trading partner, are increasingly demanding that we use low carbon energy in our exports. So that's becoming a major issue. Buildings, we have rapidly growing energy consumption. We have some 9 million building stock, and natural gas is the primary fuel here. And we also have 4 climate zones. Like Turkey may look small, it's roughly the size of California, and we have the entire variety of climates that you have in the United States within that one country, almost. And so transport is also very important. The government has a vision. This is sort of like an informal vision, not necessarily supported by any policy document, but maybe that we would have 1 million electric vehicles by 2030. Imported fossil fuels constitute 78% of primary energy supply. So you can see a lot of the challenges there in terms of the trilemma. Just a closer look at the power sector, we have renewable sources representing over 40% of generation. Solar and wind exceed 15%. This was zero about 20 years ago. So I'm going to skip over just a little bit because I have 1 minute left. Turkey's position in the global progress toward net zero carbon ratified the Paris Agreement quite late, which was last year. We have the NDC, which have been revised, and Turkey has a 1% share in global emissions. You can also call Turkey the 1% country. Turkey seems to have a 1% share in everything major in the world. So if you're falling behind the 1%, you should think about if you need more. For example, financing, we're falling behind there. Okay, Turkey's national energy plan, we have renewable power generation is set to double, while fossil power generation is maintained. We think we can do better than this, but this is the official plan that has been recently published, and you can say that renewable energy has a major share there. We also want to do storage. We want to do a little bit more coal. So this is like Alex's story of you want to expand renewables, they're good, but you also want to keep coal. We have substantial additional renewable capacity required by 2035, and what we need is something like $15 billion, which is 2.3 times what we have been investing so far. So this is one of the challenges, how to finance that. I will not go into the details of these slides because I think I will have a chance to mention them in the second round. And thank you all very much for your participation.
Thank you, Yael. I hope that you were able to do, you only left about 1% behind, right? And you could do most of the bulk of your slides. So, yeah, I think we'll now open this up for Q&A. I mean, I think there were a lot of very, very interesting topics and issues across a diverse range of countries covered. And I think there are a few things that I would like to ask, and maybe I'll start off with one or two, and then we'll open it up for the floor. Please feel free to come over after that. So maybe just to start with, a very quick question. Obviously, we went through a whole range of things, but if you were to take the 30,000 feet view of developing/emerging countries as a whole, and if you were to say, okay, these are the top 1 or 2 barriers or that need to be overcome to accelerate the deployment of renewables and to make that, whether you want to call it a transition or you want to call it a green system or a greener system, what would that be? Maybe if I could just have that very quickly from all of you.
Thank you, Ramnath. It's a very key question. I think I'll give the same answer that Swati D'Souza gave yesterday to a very similar question in the coal phase-out session, and that is money. That will drive, in a country like India, the transition that I think people want. The capability is there. It's really money. And in that connection, I'm reminded of a comparison which Rahul Tongia from the CSEP in Delhi has given. And he points out that if you take 1 billion people who currently have no electricity whatsoever, and you were to provide them with a lifeline level, a very basic level of power, and it was entirely fired by coal, that would add 0.25 of 1% to global emissions. And he uses that statement to point out exactly what Alex was saying, which is that the development needs are overwhelming, and therefore the focus must be there. Of course, the trouble is that the converse of that is not really true. If you provide that extra coal-fired power, it doesn't actually necessarily go to the people who most need it. In fact, it's going to power the air conditioners of the wealthy Delhi residents, for example. So there's a challenge, and that doesn't matter whether it's coal-fired power or renewable energy. So, yeah, but it is money in the end.
So would you say money plus equity justice?
Absolutely.
Seems like from what you're saying?
Yes.
So I mean, finance, obviously, we don't need to go further into that. But I think the other one is, the big one is storage. I think there's a lot of, when you talk about wind and solar, that gets your energy, but how do you get your capacity? How do you balance the wind and solar? And I think there's a fear, there's a perception where often a lot of these grids are very weak, they don't have transmission, they're worried they don't have mature standard operating procedures, they don't have a lot of capacity resource planning, so they don't understand storage. But then also it's just the cost of storage as well. And so I think storage is really key to enabling RE in these emerging markets.
Yeah, Sure.
Basically, what I can say is I agree with both points stated. I will not repeat them, but what I can add to this is actually policy. Policy is very important. Just to give an example in Turkey, for both the grid and for increasing renewable energy projects, we have this deadlock with things like auction systems, with things like the perception that the grid does not have flexibility options beyond integrating more fossil fire plants, etc. So it's important to be able to use all the flexibility options. Turkey is now doing more with storage. Basically, there are a lot of applications, but we haven't actually seen anything materializing yet. And I also want to stress also the justice and just transition issue. This has a lot to do with coal and transitioning from fossil fuels and transitioning from fossil fuel subsidies. And what we need to do is to have our own just transition plan, which a lot of it has been sort of given some lip service lately, but more needs to be done, both together with the international community and within Turkey, also with financing.
Thank you. Excellent. I think we have some questions from a lot of questions from the audience. That's great. Please. I think we'll just go like this.
Hello, Mehran Etabari from S&P Global. I was wondering if you might be able to talk about the role of domestic politics in some of these transition issues. Specifically, Turkey is an example that comes to mind. We have seen, again, as you mentioned, the subsidized purchases of gas in the global market being become much more unsustainable given the regulated prices within Turkey. And I think BOTAŞ has had to take out international loans a number of times in the past couple of years just to cover the losses there. But of course, Turkey was also heading towards an election this year, and therefore certainly provision of affordable energy to the masses is certainly something that is seen as a requirement to get re-election. Is there an opportunity in a post-election environment is there more of an opportunity for reform there? Of course, fully mindful of the fact that any transition or any removal of subsidies or more rationalization of domestic prices would of course have a negative impact on the population. Just really interested in your thoughts about the interplay between politics and price reform there.
I think I will take this question. Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, elections are a major factor, and they're not really over yet because we're also going to have local elections, municipal elections within the first quarter of next year. What I can say is that in terms of policy toward energy transition, the main political parties are not very different from each other. It was very interesting, for example, the vote to ratify the Paris Agreement end of 2021, it was a unanimous yes vote by both parties. So in terms of like the broad view, there's not much difference. But of course, in terms of things like subsidies, especially fossil fuel subsidies, some of this will need to be continued. But what we need to do more is to provide renewable energy alternatives. For example, we had an unfortunate and massive series of earthquakes in the southern and eastern part of Turkey beginning of this year. And it was devastating. You know, houses were destroyed, etc. But this is also this may give us an opportunity to rebuild in a more sustainable way. And some financing is being provided by international development agencies to rebuild in a more sustainable way. And why not, for example, while you're at it, to start installing heat pumps together with solar, rooftop solar installations for heating instead of some of the fossil fuel alternatives, which may, and the government could direct some of the resources that it's using to subsidize fossil fuel consumption, which is mostly imported. So that could be one idea.
Yeah, if I might just sort of, yeah, please, but I think it's important, again, when we talk about developing and emerging economies and the West or in the US, in most developing economies, and I think we spoke about it briefly yesterday, this is not a political thing. There's not a political ideology thing. It's not like in the US where, something is associated with Republicans and therefore is instinctively opposed by Democrats and vice versa. There is actually a lot of agreement between various opposition parties in many of the developing countries as to the way forward. Please.
Thanks, Peter Bobel, Bank Watch. We talk a lot about the finance on this session, and one of the things why the finance is not available are the risks. Whether they are real or perceived risks, they basically increase the cost of the capital. This is how the banking in general works. Quite interestingly, if we're looking to the Ukraine, that from the banking perspective, you will find it probably the most risky country. Yeah. And yet, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, European Investment Bank, they are able to provide the loans to the country. Why they are able to do that? Because European countries are basically taking full guarantees on those loans. Here we're talking about a far less risky business. Yeah, we're talking about the installing of renewables, agrivoltaics, etc., where you have still some risks, but the risks are more general, the country risks than actually, the technology. It's very much proven, etc., So I'm wondering whether you actually know about the mechanisms which already exist when the developed countries would be able to provide the guarantees, so they actually de-risking the capital.
Who wants to go for that? Alex?
Yeah, so
sure.
I think, firstly, some of these institutions already exist, right? And kind of talked about, the World Bank and African Development Bank and Asian Development Bank, and just how much capital they're leaving on the table. And I'll give the example in India, where you actually have private capital, so like the Canadian pension funds, which are willing to fund wind and solar projects, exactly as you said, because they're low risk. And yet you have the World Bank that's unable to fund these projects because their lending practices are so conservative. They're actually more conservative than the private institutions. So I think a lot of it has to do with pushing these existing IFIs to be more aggressive in their risk taking, to be leaders in terms of taking both commercial and technology risks, and also to be providing these concessional financing. Like I was talking to Kanika yesterday about this MIGA, which is, provides a guarantee insurance. They've only ever paid out twice in the last 20 years, right? So clearly they need to be taking, they're not really taking aggressive risks. And I think a lot of people, certainly when I joined the World Bank, but I think a lot of people more generally are under the impression that that's the point of these institutions, to go build a solar farm in Mali, which has all sorts of risks associated with it. And basically they've structured their credit practices that they're not willing to do that. The other potential avenue is philanthropic capital. And this is something ISA is looking at a lot, is maybe someone like a Rockefeller Foundation or a MacArthur Foundation actually is willing to go fund a solar project in Mali. But that's $100 million. That's a lot of money for an institution to take on.
Could I
Yes,
just add,
you want to add something to it, please feel free.
Yeah, just wanted to add, if I might, that To de-risk the transition, scale is really important, and one really excellent example, I think, of that is the Ujala initiative in India to basically get rid of old-fashioned light bulbs and replace them with new ones. It was done at an enormous countrywide scale, and the government stepped in to structure it in such a way that it could mobilize the resources to do that. Very, very effective. So scale is part of de-risking, I think.
That's a very good segue to my question, actually. So actually, for essentially we are talking about the bottom 30% of the population for the most of the transition to happen in many of these countries, right? So including India, because you pointed out a very important part of the challenge that we are facing. So, and there the capital is not moving for whatever reasons that we are discussing. Do you see a or do you envisage, for all of you on the panel, do you actually envisage a role in public financing, the old school thought of public financing mechanisms? There is a new way of thinking around it, because we all see that the first loss guarantees, even if they are present in various forms, the scale is not happening, particularly in those bottom 30% of the projects or programs, especially in India, what we have seen. I know you have been working on it, but the scale is actually not there. So we by now should have actually reached out to, so for example, we talk about rooftop solar, it's less than 3.8 gigawatts in total in the level of 40 gigawatts, but there is no rooftop solar in rural India. Why it is the case? Because it is risky proposition for project proposals, right? So is there a role for traditional public financing to be placed?
Well, I just have two thoughts on that. One is sure. I mean, you look at like NDPC, and they say I can still get finance for coal cheaper than I can get finance for RE, which I think would be very surprising to a lot of people in this room, because they're getting it from the PSU, so they're getting it from the public banks. But I think a lot of it is the government has the best role in terms of demand. And you look at, for example, Vietnam. Vietnam had a very generous FIT program, and they saw 10 gigawatts of rooftop solar in basically 1 year. Whereas you look at something like Indonesia or India, where they're very, very hesitant to pay for rooftop solar. So to me, if you had a FIT program in India that said, we're going to pay the price of coal minus 1 rupee, and we're going to guarantee we'll pay you that, then you'd see the financiers come in. It's that offtake of demand. And similarly with Indonesia, it's the government is saying we're going to buy coal power from IPPs, but the government's not making those same commitments to renewable energy IPPs. So I think the role for the government is more on the demand, and the finance will follow. One last thing I want to say, and sorry for Charles, you want to add as well. The other one is pension funds. So for example, why is a Canadian pension fund investing in emerging markets, but they're not? I had a great conversation in Rwanda where they said, well, no, we can't. The actual rules, pension funds need to be extremely safe. We don't want to risk people's money. And RE is not included as a super safe asset. So I think there's a potential to unlock public money by actually changing the rules of the public pension funds and the other public assets in terms of what they can invest in.
Yeah, I'd just like to add there that the role for public finance, or one role for public finance, is to kickstart new activities. And say in the agrivoltaics area, the clear role the government could have is to sponsor research and demonstration and extension projects to really get the thing off the ground. But if you take, say, the situation in Nigeria, people talk about small modular reactors in the nuclear space. What about small modular distributed renewable energy setups, so that you could actually roll out a really well-canned system at scale where people know exactly what the kinds of risks and procedures are ahead of time? And that, I think, is a role for public finance to kickstart.
Rick Rabbit from American University in Washington, D.C. Just building on the last thing you said about the need for governments to step up their public investment, public financing, but also getting back to what we were talking about with the World Bank and the MDBs having money available that Kanika said earlier is not going out the door. even philanthropic money is some of it is having a hard time coming out the door. I wanted to ask you about, across the street from the World Bank is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Many developing countries right now are deeply in debt coming out of the post-COVID period. IMF has a lot of influence with that, trying to maintain their creditworthiness. When all this money comes, whether it's from philanthropy or the MDBs or whatever, when this money comes in, it has to be translated into the local currency before anything can be done with it. That's going to impact the exchange rate. That's going to impact money supply. That's hiring people to do things can also have an impact on the macroeconomy. These are all things the IMF is sort of obsessed about and really looks at carefully. And one concern is that the IMF's macroeconomic framework is quite conservative, and they have very tight fiscal monetary policy targets that they keep an eye on. About 15 years ago, when the world was giving a lot of money to fight HIV/AIDS, the IMF's tight framework was kind of a problem, because it kept a lot of money for HIV/AIDS spending, telling central banks to just keep it as reserves because they were afraid that hiring more doctors and nurses or rolling out these programs would be inflationary. There's a new task force looking at the same question right now, looking at the IMF and climate change financing, put together by, I know Boston University is involved, but several people around the world. And they issued their initial report looking at this question just in April of this year. And they were concerned also that this IMF framework might be a concern with the amount of money. We're talking about 100 billion a year coming in, to address climate change, energy transition. Is this issue a concern for any of you or at all on your radar? Thanks.
Yeah. If I may just sort of start off and then you can pick it up if you like, if any of you like. But just sort of from an IEEFA perspective, I mean, this is something that is very much live. It is something that is a real issue, and we do look at it, and we do sort of, we have put our views to the different policymakers, including at the IMF World Bank meeting a couple of months ago. And I think you pointed out the key issues. It's a general risk-taking ability. I mean, as in a tendency to not take enough risk, to not act as catalytic as they should be. And then the second very good point that you mentioned is about the currency risk that comes in, and that's part of why that equity risk premium, or the risk premium that is being demanded from renewables is so high, is inordinately high. It's partly because of this. And I think, we know the solutions. We just need to implement them. I mean, we know that there needs to be a certain higher amount of risk-taking to be made available. And some other innovative proposals also currently, like as we talk, they're underway, is the so-called Bridgetown proposals, which thinks about charging a certain, I'm not sure how successful it'll be, whether it'll be shot down or whether it'll succeed. I don't know, but there are things that are happening on that, but we know where the issues are. And we are sort of, from our side, we are talking about it and putting it up. Anyone? Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Just a little aside. I think it's very good that this has been brought up, because what we're seeing right now, for example, in Turkey, is that we have a big currency problem together with foreign debt, plus high inflation. It's like one of the highest in the world right now. And we have had sort of like a loose monetary policy until recently, which is probably going to get tighter starting this year. And it's a real concern for things like we have just talked about, like energy affordability, but also for new projects, because up until now, Turkey was good at financing its renewable energy projects with a lot of long-term loans and under more or less favorable conditions. Conditions are going to get a lot less favorable starting now, and it's a big challenge for the government to tackle.
In fact, I think just last night, the Turkish central bank raised interest rates by 650 basis points.
Yes, and which was actually less than what was anticipated.
Right, so the rate of interest there now is 15%. So if you think 5% out here is high, it just went up by 6.5% last night in Turkey.
Well, I just want to make two quick comments. One on the inflation aspect, And I think this is just a classic example where there's a double standard between fossil fuels and renewable energy. So you look at Turkey, as Yael was talking about, well, fossil fuel imports actually are a major driver of these fiscal account deficits and inflation. But we just say, oh, well, people need to drive their cars, so we just accept that. And this is in India where people are really opposed to having solar imports and building solar for these sorts of concerns. But at the same time, they mandated coal imports. And India is actually the world #1 importer of coal. And it's a huge drain, and it's a huge cause of inflation, this fossil fuel imports. But why do we do it? Because we say, well, we need fossil fuel imports because we need to power the economy. So I think reframing it so that we're ensuring that renewables are not talked about in an environmental way, but as important for development as fossil fuels is really, really, really crucial. On the currency risk, I'll give an example. South Africa, at IFC, we were funding a solar plus storage project in South Africa, but the currency hedging fell on the project developer. And so we actually had a concessional climate finance that was worth 3%, but then the cost of currency hedging added 3%, so it just wiped out the concessional financing. And they basically said, well, we'll just get our local bank financing. And so I think we really need to ask, if you are donating money, if you are a development institution, to me, if a private entity like a Goldman Sachs or a Brookfield says, I'm going to take currency risk, I don't understand why World Bank or an ADB can't say, I'm going to take currency risk as well.
Please.
Ashish Fernandez from Taranto Crescent. So my question is to Alex, actually, great presentation by the way. On storage, why are we not seeing short duration storage being deployed in India at the scale that we need? I mean, it's cost effective apparently, all the studies say it's cheaper than coal, at least short duration storage, but we're not seeing too much deployment. Do you have any ideas to why that is?
People are really bad at math. I mean, so the problem is you have these regulators that have been building coal for 30 years, and they understand the economics of coal. And ironically in India, you actually have RTC round-the-clock power projects that are designed to mimic a coal plant's output rather than mimic the demand profile of the distribution utility. And if you look at, I used to work for a distribution utility, and your peak is 2 hours. But that's not the way a coal plant works. A coal plant is flat for 24 hours. So you're actually designing tenders to replicate a coal plant. When I ask people how much does storage cost, and they say, well, solar is 2, storage is 8, so 2 plus 8 is 10. I say, well, no, it's the blended cost. You have a little bit of solar, you have a little bit of wind, you have a little bit of storage, and the math is complicated. But when you have IES officers who rotate, and last year they were working on highways, and the year before they were working on water, and now they're working on power sector, these nuances can get really lost.
Okay, I just have a question. Again, since we're talking so much about the various costs from a user perspective, but from a government fiscal account perspective, we were talking about interest rates, etc. Fossil fuels do contribute a lot to the taxation in many countries, And what, in your opinion, how much of a role does that play in the thinking in terms of renewables? And how do you see that playing out in the future in terms of the gap that may be created in the budget? How would that be accounted for? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these countries have budget deficits, and they're not particularly. So, if you have any thoughts on those.
I can take this up because I find this very interesting. Very interestingly, this almost never comes up in discussions in Turkey, although we have a major contribution made to our budget by taxes on gasoline and other transport fuels, and it's never really talked about. But some of it perhaps could be compensated by a carbon tax, which we're not quite sure, because then the carbon tax also would need to be balanced so that you don't totally stifle. We don't have a carbon tax currently, by the way. We are planning on an ETS system within the next couple of years or so. So some of it may be taken up there, but I think what we need is actually a whole different approach to taxation, because it's a problem when most of your tax revenues are actually indirect taxes rather than income taxes, and that's something that's being discussed in Turkey.
I think we are up for time, but if you want to go very quickly.
Sure, yeah, this would be very, very region dependent. So like a coal exporter like Indonesia or South Africa, it's a very, very, very serious question. In India, even, Jharkhand is a coal exporter, so it's very important for them to figure out what are the alternative sources of revenue, whereas Gujarat is a coal importer, so for them it's less of an issue. And I think part of it is, we know that the economic benefits are positive. How do we capture that? So Charles made the point about 1,900 passenger trains getting canceled because of coal. If you take that rail lines that are being used for exporting coal from Jharkhand and reallocate it to agricultural products or manufactured goods, the economic benefits are there, but how are you going to extract the taxes, and how are you going to compensate, and how are you going to pay? And that's where the just transition framework is really important.
Great. Thank you all very much for, I think, a very lively and very knowledge-enhancing discussion. Thank you to the audience for some great questions. I think we will not stand between lunch for you now.